Hey guys, Devin Gridley at AllFather Fitness, and today we're going to be talking about strength and hypertrophy training. We're going to be going over rep, volume, intensity, and intensity between strength and hypertrophy. We're going to be going over the differences of effort and fatigue, or more likely known as RPE, now that it has become such a huge topic between strength and hypertrophy. We're going to be talking about the recovery periods, the block explanations, and the optimization of these training techniques. So, first thing we're going to cover is the repetitions, the volume, and the intensity at which you should be training in strength or in hypertrophy. So, the rep ranges for strength are between 1 to 6, and that's how many reps you should be doing to optimize strength. And in hypertrophy, the rep ranges that I specifically do are between 6 and 12, and it actually goes up to 30, and anything past that would be more endurance training. So if you're having like a hard time in your hypertrophy block, not gaining anything, try going into a higher rep range and getting more of a pump really, and just going after getting better mind-muscle connection. That's really what that would get you. So in strength training, there is less volume and intensity than hypertrophy because of more fatigue set in from more cumulative stress, and that is weight load, not workload, weight load, because it's obviously strength. You're going to be lifting more weight. And in hypertrophy, you're able to have more volume, intensity, and because of lower fatigue from less overall stress, allows maintaining high RPE through multiple sets and workouts, which is obviously really, really good. You don't have as much fatigue. You can train harder more often, which is obviously really good. But you have to realize that the RPE for strength and hypertrophy is different. You have to understand that going as hard as you possibly can with hypertrophy is a lot different than going as hard as you possibly can with strength. So keep that in mind, and I will cover that a little bit later in the video. So effort and fatigue. So in strength, we already covered this. Strength accumulates fatigue way faster because you have a higher weight load, and that's going to put a lot more stress on you, and things like your obviously your muscles, but your ligaments and joints, and everything that's in between all those things. So it obviously is going to accumulate more stress, and that makes sense. But having a lot of fatigue is not really optimal. Obviously, you want to be able to recover really fast and get in the gym and hit it just as hard as you did last time. But you're able to have more effort per set at a higher RPE, but less sets because of higher stress. So you're able to kind of offset it really. And in hypertrophy, less fatigue from lower weight load, but you do have more workload because of more volume, more intensity, more sets, more reps, all that good stuff. So you're able to have less effort per set because of low cumulative stress absorbed because of that lower weight load, but more sets because of low stress, and you're able to have a higher workload. And keep those two things in mind because I cover those a lot, and it's kind of important to understand what those really mean. So now we're going to go into RPE. So RPE is different in strength training as it is in hypertrophy training. It still is rate of exertion exertion. So it's how much effort you put into a set, but how much effort you put into a set of a strength is completely different to how much effort you put into any hypertrophy workout really. And this is kind of hard to understand when you read this. If you bench 100 pounds for 12 reps at an RPE of 10, meaning you couldn't have got another rep even with a gun to your head, that means after your 1 rep max would only be 143 pounds for 1 at an RPE of 10 as well. But now you can't really understand this unless you've been training for a long period of time, but if you can bench 100 pounds for 12 reps, you should be able to bench a lot more than 143. I would go and probably say you could bench a little bit closer to 160 for 1 RPE of 10. That would make a lot more sense to me. But if you want to go and test this yourself, what you do is grab 100 pounds for 12 reps, or not 12 reps, do 100 pounds, get your maximum amount. I'm sure you'll get over 12 reps, but get your maximum amount, and then if you know your max, put that 100 pounds for whatever reps you had into a 1 rep max calculator, and it will be significantly less than your actual max will be. So that's how the RPE is different, but it still measures how much effort you put into a set. But you have to understand that they are different when you're talking about strength and when you're talking about hypertrophy. So now we're going to be talking about the recovery periods and block explanation of it. So the block explanation really, in a strength, you're going to have less volume, you're gonna have less intensity, you're gonna have less sets, less of everything really, but because you have a higher weight load, you're not gonna have as high a workload, and the opposite goes for hypertrophy. So because of more stress and fatigue, you need more optimized recovery periods, or you risk injury. And that's completely true. If you have more fatigue and you try and lift the same weight that you lifted yesterday and you're fatigued, you're either not going to get the weight up, or you're going to try to cheat it up and have really bad form and even potentially injure yourself, which is obviously not good. And that's why there's less volume and intensity per session. And hypertrophy recovery is not nearly as important because of low risk of injury stemming from having less weight load but having more workload. But obviously I've covered this. I know it sounds like a broken record because I go back and forth of basically saying the same thing, but it's there. You can read it. I feel like this is a little bit more understanding, but since you have a higher or a lower weight load in hypertrophy blocks, then you can have a higher workload, and you're not going to be as fatigued as much because you're not going to have as much stress. You're just going to have a way higher workload. So more volume and intensity because of lower risk of injury, which is obviously really, really good. You don't want to get injured. So now we're going to talk about optimization. So in strength, increases in weight load benefit strength training. Obviously, I've said that a lot. Increases in weight load are going to benefit your strength because the more weight you put on, the stronger you obviously are. That's just kind of how it works. That's kind of, just common sense, but a lot of people just need to kind of hear it, I guess. But the lifts you train for in strength are the only ones you need to do because the muscles you need to train are being optimally trained in those lifts as is. And this is kind of a little bit hard to understand, but if you think about it, if you're training for the bench press, you're training all your muscles exactly how they're supposed to be. Your chest is being trained. These aren't accurate numbers, but your chest is being trained 50%, your triceps are being trained 25%, and your shoulders are being trained 25%, right? So they're all being trained exactly the same time and exactly the same amount of workload, as long as you don't have any fatigue left over from in certain muscle groups. So you don't need such a diverse range of exercises. You just have the bench, the deadlift, the squat, whatever ones you're training for. And you don't really need to train anything more than that. You don't need isolation movements or anything like that to build strength. You just need to do those lifts, and you'll get progressively stronger over time. So in hypertrophy, increases in either weight load or workload benefit hypertrophy more, allowing significantly more gains. So, and you can literally add more of anything in a hypertrophy block and it will benefit you, and that's 100% true. You could increase the weight, you can increase how many reps you do, how many sets you do, how many workouts you do. It doesn't matter. Everything's going to get you more gains and more muscle, which is obviously really good. And there's more types of exercises or diversity, and this leads to better development because there's equal loads on every part of every single muscle. So a good way, this is kind of hard to understand as well, but if you think about it, most muscles have multiple muscles in that muscle group. So if you think about the tricep, it's called the tricep because there's 3 different heads. So if you're training just the bench press, you're hitting probably the long head or the medial head more than you're hitting the lateral head of the triceps. So you're not going to have a really big lateral head of your triceps, so you're going to isolate it by doing a certain type of movement, and you're able to put the same amount of workload on that muscle as the other muscles. And that's obviously really important if you're going to be a bodybuilder or whatever. You want to have symmetry. You want all your muscles to be relatively the same size based on, how much muscle they actually have. So yeah, that covers everything about strength and hypertrophy training. This really wasn't like, oh, strength is better, hypertrophy is better, because there's no way I could tell you that, obviously. I just wanted to go over what about strength makes strength, strength training, and what about hypertrophy training makes it hypertrophy training. And if you are specifically training for strength and you noticed, hey, I'm kind of doing something that's in the hypertrophy section, I should probably stop doing that. That's probably a really good idea. Or vice versa, you're doing hypertrophy, you just want to build muscle, and you're doing something in the strength, and you're like, oh, I should probably stop doing that. And you might not. It doesn't really matter because, hypertrophy gets gains from everything, but strength does not. It's very more optimized and very much more specific than hypertrophy training. And it's important to know that, especially if you want to, go really far with it and become a really good power lifter, obviously. And yeah, and I also want to point out the fact that strength and hypertrophy are not directly correlated. And I should have covered that in the very beginning of the video, but I did not, unfortunately. A lot of people don't realize that strength and hypertrophy are not directly correlated. If they were, you would have seen somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Ronnie Coleman, and they would be the strongest man alive, but they are not. Thor Bjornsson, Eddie Hall are. Even though they do have a lot of muscle, but they're not bodybuilders. They're strongmen, powerlifters, you know. And if you look at any powerlifter, they're not going to be super big and jacked like a bodybuilder is. And that's how you can really easily tell, and that's the proof that hypertrophy and strength gains are not directly correlated. But if you increase your strength, you're eventually going to increase your muscle size. And if you increase your muscle size, you're going to increase your strength. But they are not directly correlated, and that's very important to understand. So if you're just training for strength, don't do a lot of hypertrophy things. If you're just training for hypertrophy, don't train a lot of strength things, because they are not directly proportional to each other. And that's very important to understand if you want to go far with what you're doing. But really, if you don't even know what you're doing, a lot of these things are like, oh, strength, you keep saying it puts a lot of fatigue on you, a lot of stress, you know, it's really hard, blah, blah, blah. It seems like it's a lot more complicated. I'm not really so sure I want to do that. That's perfectly fine. Go and do hypertrophy, and that, you know, that's perfectly fine. And vice versa, you're like, oh, for some reason you wouldn't like hypertrophy training. You're like, oh, I'd be in the gym too long because I'd be doing too many exercises, too many sets, too many reps. It just seems like you just do too much, and that's kind of overwhelming. Maybe I should do strength. It seems a lot easier because you're just doing 1 or 2 movements a day, and you're just doing a few sets at really high weights, and that seems pretty easy. And that's completely true. So yeah, hopefully this helped you out. Hopefully it kind of pointed out different things in each. I'm not saying one's better than the other. That's completely up to you and what you want to do, as well as your genetic makeup on, like, based if you would be good at bodybuilding or good at powerlifting. That's completely up to your genetics, as well as, you know, your mindset and what you want to go and do. But I did want to point out some of the discrepancies between strength and hypertrophy training, as well as pointing out exactly what strength training is, as well as what hypertrophy training is. And I plan on making this a playlist, putting, you know, different things about strength, different things about hypertrophy, and just completely optimizing it. But this was just that kind of the kickoff of that entire playlist, and hopefully you enjoyed it. But that was really all I got for today on strength and hypertrophy training. If you liked the video, please like the video, obviously, and go and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you are subscribed, please consider watching the videos that I will bloop up, or any of the ones down in the description you find interesting. And I will see you in the next one.